Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to the Vald Performance online workshop series. Really fortunate to be working with the team here at Vald Performance to bring you some content over the coming weeks and months that I think you'll find really engaging and interactive. Today I'm going to talk to you about the considerations for athletic performance during this lockdown period. It's a really unique time for all of us in professional and semi-professional sport because there are so many different considerations that we're having to make in relation to athletic performance. The main considerations that we're having to take into account are our individual and group response. So within your organisation, how are individuals responding to what's currently going on around the globe? And then how is your organisation responding to support those individuals and support staff and players in dealing with the current events around the globe? Once you've been able to, hopefully as an organisation, identify how the group is responding and how certain individuals are responding to this, it's really important to set out a clear objective or goal that you're trying to achieve during this period, especially for teams like mine that it's in the Australian Football League where our season had only just started. So what are we trying to gain out of this lockdown or lockout period? The restrictions around remote training, and here in Australia, the ability for athletes to only train in groups of two, and what that does depending on the equipment that they have at their exposure. Their ability to collaborate and connect with each other. So what does that look like from an athlete perspective, but also from a staff perspective? If you're still working within your performance department or within your medical department, how are you collaborating remotely to bring the best possible program to your athletes when you're used to spending 7 days a week with them, possibly face to face? And how do we measure compliance during this period? Because we can all say that we've developed a great bodyweight strength program or a great home-based gym program, but at the end of the day, it's going to take the empowerment and the ownership from the athlete to actually participate within that program. And it's really hard for us to actually understand what they're doing, the intensity that they're doing it at, and if they are being compliant with the program that we're putting in place with them. And then how do we measure load? One of the main metrics in AFL is GPS. So we can't send all of our players away with a GPS unit to monitor their load. Are we willing to use GPS watches and the reliability around possibly getting guys to record their training sessions? But even then, how much further strain is that putting on the individual with constantly having to provide feedback around what they're doing when there's a period of time that they're unsure how long they're going to be doing this for? Usually what we'd be doing in this period, if we were playing sport, we'd actually be collaborating and working on what our training outcomes are. But as I spoke before, no longer can we measure external load, and we have to look at what particular components of internal load we think is important to get from the athlete to give them the message that we want to make sure that we understand what they're exposing themselves to in what could possibly be quite an uncertain time for them, and especially for guys who are later in their career, how this may possibly be impacting their mental state and their ability to train hard away from the group. So what sort of metrics are we going to be able to use that aren't placing too much strain on the athlete or the staff that are communicating with them, but are providing us with reliable information to then action upon that? And usually in a AFL setting, we'd be actioning on that day to day based on their training modification, but it may have to be a week to week variation that you're looking at. Strength and the importance of strength training has been documented in a lot of the research, and I highlight this paper by Sukumal and co because it's really interesting now with us in AFL, where we're going into a competitive phase where possibly we're looking at more vertical integration around our strength, power and hypertrophy components. But what should our periodization look like now when we're uncertain of the timeframes that are there in front of us? Do we go back to an off-season model, or do we go into a pre-season model where we really look to harness some of those maximal strength capacities, and how long do then we hold those capacities for? And these are all, I'm sure, discussions that you've had within your own departments, and that you're probably having with other practitioners day to day. Because then the flip side of that is how you're integrating that within your individual and group conditioning plans, and whether or not, once again, you're focusing on a general preparation period or a specific preparation or pre-competition period, or are you going back to that off-season model of giving the guys possibly a greater gradual growth in training load exposure and aerobic conditioning exposure? Or do you try and maintain some of those game-specific capacities across a period that you're uncertain how long will last for? And hopefully what we're all trying to do within this period is continue to develop our athletes to the best of their ability with the constraints that are in front of us. And I highlight this paper by Gabbard and Co. around the factors that may interact to hopefully increase physical capacities, but also look to try and decrease injury risk or mitigate injury, however we want to name it. But once again, so many of these factors come back to applying an appropriate training load or a specific training load or sports-specific training load capacity, which in the current climate, it's really hard to do. So what is it that's actually the best scenario for the environment that you're in, given the constraints around interacting with athletes and athletes interacting with each other? The risks that this apply for athletic performance is it'll be quite easy for some of our athletes to possibly disengage. And this is a great slide or graph around what some of the work that the AFL Players Association have done within the mental health space and the mental health continuum that is really paramount and important for us to discuss in this time, because for a lot of these athletes, they have been within a system where they've had routine and they've had regime for so long, where now they're having to operate on their own internal motivations or hopefully external motivations if they're connecting with their teammates. But there's a high chance that they may struggle with coping mechanisms throughout this period and disengage with either their teammates or possibly even with staff, because all it takes is for you not to answer your phone and engage on Zoom calls or engage on a text message or WhatsApp. So it's quite easy for athletes to disconnect if they choose so, because we're in a restricted phase of how we can interact with each other. The other component of that is then the detraining component, and I highlight this research here that Kramer and Co were a part of, that basically they had applied a 16-week strength and power protocol to well-trained adolescents. And what you see after a 4-week detraining effect was that there was small changes in maximal strength output, but there was actually significant changes in power output. So if we have a period where athletes disengage and possibly aren't compliant with their program, the risk is we're going to then lose physical qualities which may be important for the sport that they're involved in. And we need to understand that is a possible risk at this period. The great thing from this paper was that it actually also showed that with the tapering group, they actually increased strength and power output during their tapering phase. So if guys miss a session here or there may not be an adverse effect. And the one stimulus that our guys aren't getting is the competitive game, which is typically the highest stimulus they would get in a week. So hopefully our guys are recovering better between training sessions and are able actually to train at a higher intensity because they're not getting that residual effect from games. And the flip side of that is possibly an increase in injury risk. And I highlight the paper here that has had a little bit of traction around social media with the 2011 NFL lockout period and an increase in Achilles tendon ruptures post the lockout period. Now, with all of these things, injury is multifactorial, and I haven't worked in the NFL and can't comment to what other factors played a role within that. But it's something that we have to take into consideration if we have athletes that don't complete or aren't compliant with the program that we've put in front of them. There is a chance that possibly if we go in with too an aggressive a program or too an advanced a program, that we may have athletes break down. And for some organisations, they might not have the time to just slowly progress their load. And that just may be part of the discussion within your performance department is, you know, that there's an increased risk and you're just going to have to assess that day to day, because if you don't increase the load from skills or from conditioning on your team, then they're not going to be prepared for the worst case scenarios in the game demands once they do start playing. The opportunity, though, that we have here for athletic performance is that no longer do we have a time constraint. So we're pre-season or off-season, we're constrained by possible the amount of time we can train an athlete or how long we have. At this point, we're currently unsure of when we're going to return. So time is actually not a constraint that we need to necessarily worry about. And it's how can we actually effectively use that time to get the most out of the athlete. And that's why I see this as a real opportunity to possibly work with athletes on an individualized perspective to see what characteristic can you actually work on to develop that you wouldn't be able to actually develop in an in-season period. Is it maximal strength work? Is it aerobic capacity or anaerobic capacity work? Is it related to mobility or competence in performing a complex lift in the gym? How can you manipulate that to suit the athlete? It may be even nutritional standards, because you can't just go to a restaurant anymore or go out for breakfast as frequently. So how can you use this period to actually engage in the nutritional strategies that these guys are doing, especially if they're doing 2-a-day training sessions or multiple training sessions across the week. And hopefully from that, then you're able to create athlete ownership throughout their program. And what I spoke about earlier was the guys within high performance sport are sometimes so used to being within a structured schedule that they lose that ability to own their decision-making processes and own what their program should look like. So now is a really great opportunity to build connection within your playing group, for them to own their own program and for them to drive their own standards and training standards between each other. So the opportunity here for developing a strong culture around connection between teammates and collaboration around their program is I think really exciting. And hopefully, I definitely know that there are some organisations that have looked at it that way. And because in all of this, it's about whether or not we're able to grow and learn from the process, or whether we're just going to be fixed in our mindset of, we don't have access to gym, we don't have access to what we're usually used to, we can't train together, so we can't perform our usual tasks together. Or we actually look at it as a challenge to help grow your players and possibly work on things that you wouldn't have actually been able to work on if you had them in reviewing games or playing games and those sorts of things. So I think the ability for us as practitioners to demonstrate a growth mindset to our players is really pivotal in what changes you can make across the culture within your performance department or your greater organisation. And the opportunity there for us as practitioners is here in some of Aaron Coots's work, in that ability to be that fast practitioner. We haven't had the time, because this coronavirus has hit so quickly, we haven't necessarily had time to have the best plans in place before this period. So how, as a practitioner, have you been able to adapt to the scenario, grow to the scenario, and then retrospectively analyse what you've done and possibly use that slow researcher concept to then provide more context to the daily systems that you've put in place? And I don't think there's any harm in possibly reviewing your program that you've set out and possibly telling the athletes that you need to change it, because all of a sudden, all right, we planned for 4 weeks, but now it looks like 8 or it looks like 12. And you need to be able to admit to them that at this stage, none of us have gone through this and we're all learning from the experience. So our day-to-day learnings and our day-to-day modifications will hopefully create the best possible program for all of our athletes. I hope that you enjoyed that presentation and it's got you thinking about possibly what you're doing within your own organisation. I know we have some great presentations from David Watts from the Melbourne Demons Football Club in the AFL, and from Simon Thomas from Crusaders Rugby in today's web series. So I'll finish with, I hope everyone stays home, stays healthy, and stay connected through the Veld Performance web series, as we'll have plenty more content to come. Thank you.